I do. Sure. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. So a couple of items of business before we get started. So the first of these is that I had a request to post the slides in a different format, 6 to a page instead of 3 to a page with the lines of notes. I actually personally prefer having 6 slides per page instead of the lines of notes, but about 4 years ago when I did that, people complained about that and said, can you do 3 with the notes? And so I took a vote, and people voted the way they voted. This person asked, and so I said I'd be happy to take another vote, because if you guys feel differently, I'm happy to do it. However, but I'm only happy to do it one way. I'm not going to spend all afternoon after class each time coming up with 6 different ways of posting the slides. I haven't actually given you the options for the vote yet, so raising your hands now may not make a lot of sense, but I'm guessing there's a question. Nope. Nope. Nope, I don't post those online for multiple reasons, but no, I post PDFs of the slides. What I'll do is I'll take a show of hands for wanting 3 slides per page, the way they're currently being posted, or 6 slides per page. If you want 3 slides per page, raise your hands. If you want 6 slides per page, raise your hands. All right. See, people just want whatever they don't have. And someone just said 4 per page. How many people would want 4 per page? Okay, well, the people who want 4 per page can just cut off the bottom where the other 2 are. Okay, so I'm going to switch to 6 per page going forward, and that's what we'll do for the rest of this quarter. And then next quarter, someone can complain about that, and we'll have a vote, and everyone will vote for 3. Okay. Second item of business, God bless you. And God bless whoever was in front of you. Okay, so there's a slight change on the syllabus. Well, that's not true. There may end up being a slight change on the syllabus. It is not fully determined yet. I have to discuss some things with the TAs. Currently, the week 6, which starts with Monday, November 2nd, we have class on November 3rd and November 5th. Currently, we're scheduled to have the midterm on that Tuesday, and a lecture on self-esteem on that Thursday. Okay. I am thinking about switching those 2, but, and I'll say this multiple times, if I do end up switching them, the self-esteem lecture will not be on the midterm. Okay? So the material for the midterm is set ending with the lecture on losing control. Okay? I believe I'm going to end up switching the midterm to the 5th, but if I do, you'll have the exact same content, and so I'm just giving you a heads up that that may happen. I'll give you more information as I know more. And then the last little bit of business before we jump back in, is that there are a couple of classes that are canceled, including this coming Thursday and next Thursday. It's on the syllabus. No class Thursday, no class next Thursday. And I'm guessing about 95% of you think that's awesome that there's no class on Thursday this week or next week. That's how I would have felt when I was an undergraduate. But for that 5% of you thinking, we're just not going to get enough of Matt this quarter, seeing him for 2.5 hours a week for 10 weeks, we want even more. Well, you will get more, for better or for worse, because we'll be doing review sessions for the midterm and final outside of class. And I'll also be doing a session on people thinking about going to graduate school and things you should know that are really important. If you're concerned that had you been here another quarter and it didn't have those 2 days that were canceled, you would have gotten a lot more lecture material from me. You wouldn't have. In those other quarters, I just put the review sessions in the class itself. Okay, so you're getting the same lecture content either way. So for anyone who does have that concern, like the two of you, okay, you're actually getting the same exact material. All right. So when we left off last time, we were talking about tapping. Okay, I did a very poor job of tapping the Star-Spangled Banner. Some of you knew I was going to be tapping the Star-Spangled Banner. Some of you did not know. Those of you who knew automatically heard something very different in your heads as I was tapping it. You actually heard the Star-Spangled Banner. And for the rest of you who were last week sitting here, you just heard my tapping. And probably, for the most part, had no idea what it was that I was tapping. About 50% of the time when I run this demo, the people who know what I'm tapping, they start tapping along with me, which really pisses off everyone on the other side of the room who just thinks this is the nuttiest thing. When I left off last time, I told you about this study that was done with the tapping demo, where people who were either given the label or not were asked what percentage of other people who didn't have the label, what percentage of them would be able to guess what song this was. Okay? People who didn't have the labels themselves could quite accurately predict that almost no one was going to guess. But people who did have the label themselves had the cursive knowledge, they had this changed immediate experience, and they could not get themselves into the shoes of a person who did not already know the answer. And so they thought 50% of people would be able to guess the name of the song. Okay? So if you're in this condition and find out that nobody else can figure out the name of the song, you think they're kind of stupid, right? And these people who can't figure out the song, who are dealing with those folks who think they should be able to figure out the song, just hate those folks. Okay? So it really doesn't make for good social interactions when you have these separate points of view that are really hard to get past. It's hard for these folks to understand why those folks would think what they're thinking, and vice versa. So I want to give you an example where we can dig into, and this is a research study that was done quite a while ago, I think 25 years ago, a research study that was done that lets us dig in a bit more to how this plays out in real-world social events that have consequences, but also so that we can actually see the effects of these different construals that people have, and you can see it in a kind of nice quantitative way. So there's this phenomenon in social psychology called the hostile media effect. Okay? And the idea here is that if you go out and find news articles, and this is back in the 80s before we had MSNBC and Fox News, and the folks on both sides that really want to push a particular ideological agenda. Okay? Both sides do. Back when maybe this was around the time CNN was starting. Okay? The news was really considered, for the most part, down the middle, drab, no voice of its own. And they took news stories that were related to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and these were stories that were rated by neutral individuals as being sort of equally showing positive and negative things about both sides. So they were pretty neutral in their overall coverage. Okay? However, when these same news stories were shown to individuals that were pro-Israeli, they thought the news coverage overall was quite anti-Israeli. Okay? And when those same stories were shown to individuals who were pro-Arab viewers of the news, they thought those same stories were actually pro-Israeli. Okay? So these are two groups with their own built-in biases, and both sides essentially think the media is biased against them. Both sides see the same relatively unbiased media accounts, and both sides say they're out to get us. They're against my side of things. Okay. So we can break this down in a way that I think makes very clear what's going on here, that I think helps understand the idea of situational construal and the biases it introduces in a clear way. So imagine that we could align people on a scale of how pro-Israel they are, from plus 100, which is the maximal pro-Israel you could be, to minus 100, which is the most anti-Israel you could be. Okay, and we might imagine that the viewers in that study who were pro-Israel might not have been all the way up here, but let's say they were at plus 75. The anti-Israel subjects were at minus 75, but the actual media was at 0. Okay, so let's start with those assumptions. The problem comes that when you ask this pro-Israeli person what pro-Israeli material looks like, it only looks like this, right? Because the pro-Israeli person doesn't think they're biased in favor of Israel. They just think they see things as they are. I see reality, I'm neutral. Neutral happens to mean Israel is right, but I'm neutral. Okay, I'm an unbiased person. So now if you find those people who are so pro-Israeli that they're to the right of me, yeah, they're biased to the right. Okay? So yeah, there are people on my side who are biased. They're further to the right of me. I'm at the neutral point. The problem is that these folks who are at plus 75, they're plus 75s, but they think they're zeros. All right? They think they live here, but they really live here. So the problem, okay, is that they think all of this, anything that comes in this range, is anti-Israel. Okay, this is just like the driving example. Anyone who's more anti-Israel than you are, including other people over here who consider themselves pro-Israel, okay, they're not pro-Israel enough, so they're anti. Okay. So the problem is that for the pro-Israeli folks, 0 is in the anti-Israel range. Okay. When we reverse this and we look at the folks who are the anti-Israeli subjects in this study, they think, yeah, there are really anti-Israeli people. They're the people who are to the left of me on this scale. And they're crazy. Okay, they're crazy, but I'm not crazy. I'm totally neutral and unbiased. It just so happens Israel is completely wrong, and I happen to be the person who can see reality for what it is. So anyone to my left is anti, and anyone to my right is pro-Israel. Right? And the problem is that the 0 point for them is right in the middle of their pro-Israel range. Okay? So these two groups, right, are both biased, but by not recognizing their own bias, they think other individuals, the media here in the middle, they think that group is a biased group relative to what they take to be reality. And reality is whatever it is that I see. And I'm unbiased. I'm an unbiased perceiver of reality. Okay? So the pro-Israeli person mistakes their 75 for being a 0, and the anti-Israeli person mistakes their minus 75 for being a 0. Okay? Does this make sense? Yes? No? Okay, good. Okay. So I've shown you a couple things along these lines. It turns out social psychologists study an enormous range of biases that we have in our judgments of others. This was one, the hostile media effect. I'm going to tell you about some others along the way, the fundamental attribution error, and a number of other errors that we make. Emily Pronin, who's a professor at Princeton, did a study where she described all these different kinds of biases to subjects. So you'd come in and you'd kind of get a paragraph description of all these different biases, about 10 of them, that social psychologists study. And then after each bias, you were asked, to what extent do you make this error? Do you show this bias? And then they were also asked, to what extent does the typical person show this error or bias? Okay? And what she found is that for every single one of them, people thought, yeah, I might show a little bit of the bias, shown in the black bars, but everybody else shows more. Okay? So yeah, I believe this bias exists, and I might even be guilty of it sometimes, but however much I'm guilty of it, you're all guilty of it more. Okay? And these are all very different kinds of biases, and we'll talk about a number of them. Okay? But it's our inability to recognize our own contributions to our experience and judgment that leads us to be biased without recognizing it. But when we see someone else who's biased, it jumps off the page at us. So everybody else is biased, and us, not so much. All right, the last major thing I want to say about, or discuss about, subjective construal is getting at the heart of whether or not this subjective construal account is really right. So everything I've told you so far allows subjective construal to be a nice story, a nice account of what we've seen here. But nobody has really dug in these studies that I've shown you and gone in and gotten to the subjective construal itself and shown how that's really driving it. Okay? So here's a little demo. I just want you to, for yourself, answer this question. Okay, you can write it down on a piece of paper in front of you. You don't have to say it out loud. Okay? I want you to think about other people in this classroom and think about what percentage of people in this classroom do you think prefer 1960s music over 1980s music? Okay, so what percentage would prefer 1960s music? You can go ahead and write down your answer. Should be an answer from 0 to 100%. Red is not the right answer. Sorry. Okay, second question. Do you prefer music from the 1960s or 1980s? Okay. So, how many people said they think at least 70% of the other people in this room prefer music from the 1960s? Raise your hands. Okay. Now keep your hands up. If you said that, did you put down that you prefer music from the 1960s as well? Yes. Okay. You can put your hands down. How many of you said at least how many of you said 30% or lower for this answer? So you think most people would prefer the 80s, and keep your hand up if you put that you prefer the 80s. Okay? So about 85% of you, okay, who said you think that a lot of people will prefer the 60s or the 80s, express the same preference yourself. This is called the false consensus effect. It's another thing that originally comes from Lee Ross at Stanford, and the study I'm going to be talking about over the next few minutes is a study by Tom Gilovich, who's a professor at Cornell who does really, really awesome research. They both do. Okay. So in the study that they ran, and this was back in 1990 that Gilovich ran this study, so the 80s had just ended, about 50% of people said that most people would prefer the 80s, and 50% said that people would prefer the 60s. Okay? But both groups thought that whatever they said about others was what was true of themselves. That is, they projected from their own beliefs a false consensus onto everyone else. I think that everyone else thinks what I think. That's called the false consensus effect. When I hold a belief that I use to estimate what other people think too. Okay? That's kind of like the reasonable person standard that I've talked about before. If I think it's true, any reasonable person would come to that conclusion. Now, what Gilovich did that was really important, that took this a big step further, is he asked people, he said, after he ran them through this study and got their answers, he said, what bands do you associate with the 1960s? And what bands do you associate with the 1980s? And what he was trying to get at was that individual's construal of music from the 1960s and music from the 1980s. There's lots of ways to think about what music from the 1960s means. right? You could think of the Beatles. You could think of jazz music from the 60s. You could think of Donovan, which is really bad music for those of you who don't know who Donovan is. Oh, stop. No, I'm the professor. I won't stop. If you're related, I'll stop. But other than that, I'm going with it. And so what they found is that subjects who said they prefer music from the 1960s were thinking of systematically different bands than those who said they prefer music from the 1980s. Okay? So it wasn't really about preferring 1960s versus 1980s music. Rather, they had a particular set of bands or kinds of music they were thinking of that they associate with the 1960s and that they associate with the 1980s. And it was those two construals that they were comparing in their head. And people who liked the 60s were thinking of different bands than people who said they liked the 80s. Okay? So then they had judges rate the individual bands given by each subject. And once the bands are defined this way, everybody's choices for the most part made sense. Okay? So individual judges, when they rated the bands that the people who said they liked the 60s said they liked, individual judges, separate judges, said, yeah, those are better bands than the bands they were thinking of for the 80s. And the people who said they liked the 80s, the bands they were listing, the independent judges said, yeah, those 80s bands are better than the 60s bands they were thinking of. Okay. So the example I gave, Donovan's off the hook. So the people who said they like the 60s might be comparing the Beatles to Motley Crue, whereas those who prefer the 80s might be comparing the Bee Gees to the Police. And so, depending on those comparisons, you would come to different conclusions. So to really nail this down, what they then went on to finally do is they took new subjects, and instead of saying, okay, well, do you like the 60s or 80s better? They got to hear one of the previous subjects' lists from someone who had said they preferred the 1980s music. Okay? So they got to hear the bands that person associated with the 80s versus the 60s. And lo and behold, subjects who were asked about those two said, yes, I prefer 80s music to 60s music. But when they heard someone from the 60s list, they said, no, I prefer 60s music to 80s music. Okay? So this suggests, I think pretty strongly, that it was the underlying construal that was driving the judgments in the first place. But if we do not recognize that our construal of 60s music or 80s music isn't an all-encompassing, sort of perfect, objective definition, but rather something we've subjectively created based on sort of our associations, then we won't realize that when we disagree with someone, it's just because we've brought different bands to mind and not because we actually necessarily disagree on the substance. Now, this isn't always going to be true. There are some people who love the Bee Gees and some people who love Motley Crue. But more often than not, there's greater agreement than we appreciate when you sort of dig down into the subjective construals that we're using and realize that the other person's subjective construal was a different but reasonable construal to have. Okay. I'm not going to talk about this just because we're already 20 minutes behind on lecture for the quarter. So when you see this in the notes, don't worry about it. But during review session, if anyone wants to hear about that, I'm happy to come back to that later. We're going to move on to the lecture we're supposed to be on for today. And that is automaticity and priming. So as I talked about, when I talked about the hypotheses, automaticity plays a major part in the kinds of things we've already been talking about, subjective construal and naive realism. Okay? We think we see reality for what it is because we're unaware of our own constructive contributions to our construals, to our experience. And the reason we don't know about our subjective construals is because they're automatic. That's what we're going to be talking about here for the rest of today. So, what is this very important construct of automaticity? Well, it comes in various forms. There's perceptual automaticity. For instance, you don't have to do any mental work to see that square is red. It just appears to you as a real red square on the screen. Okay. Semantically, we have automaticity. So if I say Romeo, everyone says Juliet. Comes to mind readily without effort. You didn't have to say, I'm going to go try to come up with a word to fill that, and let me think about what my options are. Juliet just appears in our minds. Okay, that's automatic. But what about social automaticity? Do these same kinds of things work in terms of the way we socially understand other people and ourselves and interact with other people? Well, I'm going to talk about, up here I'm going to talk about 4 techniques for assessing automaticity in sort of the social realm, but it turns out that this study that I've always talked about in past quarters, I went back and listened to the podcast, and it took me about 14 minutes just to get through this one study. So there's a big red X there, which means we're not talking about that this quarter, and you should all be happy about that. The reason it takes 14 minutes is because it's a really complicated study. So anytime on any of the slides, when you see a big red X like this, or sometimes you'll see later in this lecture a big red X over the entire screen, that means you don't need to know it for the exam. It means I didn't want to delete the slide altogether because I might want to use it in some other lecture in the future. However, you don't need to know it. If you're curious, I can tell you, but you won't be curious, so you don't need to know. When we get to the midterm review, there'll be people who ask questions about those slides, and then I'll say, I'm happy to answer those questions. However, I'll start by telling you it's not on the exam, at which point they go, never mind, I don't have a question. So we're going to talk about these 3 techniques: recent exposures to primes, or what we might call priming, okay, subliminal exposure, and what's called cognitive load, or cognitive busyness, or divided attention. There's various names for that. And we'll go through one example of each kind of study to familiarize us with some of the findings that we've gotten by studying automaticity in social psychology, but mostly to get you to understand how you could use this technique to assess whether an underlying psychological process is automatic or not automatic. Okay? And next Tuesday, we'll be talking about what those things are if they're not automatic. They're called controlled processes if they're not automatic. So the first of these studies is called the prior prime exposure technique. Really, you could just think of it as priming. Okay? But it's sort of the 2-study priming technique. So Tori Higgins did this, and this is a classic first really, really important study in the study of social cognition. Okay? This was groundbreaking. This study has been cited thousands of times. Okay, Tori Higgins is at Columbia. He's probably one of the 4 or 5 most important people in the history of social cognition, which is a sub-area within social psychology. And in this study, and countless others that have followed it and used a similar style, subjects come in, and they believe that they're actually participating in 2 separate studies. So you come in, and they say, okay, first you're going to do a study here in this testing room, and since we have an hour with you and my study only takes 15 minutes, I was wondering if you would mind participating in my friend's study that's down the hall. So she's looking for subjects, and if you don't mind, after you're finished here, you could go down and be a subject in her study. And you're led to believe that these 2 studies have absolutely nothing to do with each other. You finish in one study, they tell you thank you, you're done. You go down to the next room and start the next study. And of course, in this case, the social psychologists are lying to you because that's what we do in social psychology. Okay? In fact, the 2 studies are intimately linked, but it's important for you not to know that they're linked as a subject. So you're told in this particular variant that you're going to participate in a perception study first, and then you're going to be involved in a reading comprehension study. We try to make them sound as boring as possible so that you ignore the actual content of what we're studying, because these effects don't work as well if you know what we're actually trying to study. So in the first task, which is really the priming task, where we're trying to get certain things active in your mind, so like Romeo leads to Juliet being active in your mind. Okay, we'll come back to that. It's called accessibility. When you make that term, when you make some idea or representation more active in your mind, it's more accessible. And in the perception study, okay, you're asked to hold 10 words in memory for 10 seconds at a time. So you're given a list of 10 words, and I'm sorry, I'm describing this wrong. You're given a list of 10 words, one at a time. Each word you're given, you hold it in memory for 10 seconds, and then you say the word at the end of it. Incredibly simple task, okay, but the idea is to get the person thinking about these words so that they're active in their mind, and there's key words kind of hidden as the third, fifth, seventh, and ninth words out of this 10-word list. Now, there's 4 conditions in this study, and each condition gets a different set of words for these 4, third, fifth, seventh, and ninth. The other 6 words are identical across conditions, okay? But those 4 words differ depending on what condition of the experiment you're in. Now, later, in the second study, you're going to be asked to make judgments about a person named Donald. And you're going to have some things described to you about Donald, and then you're going to make a judgment. In one of the conditions during the priming, when you're doing that working memory task of keeping those words in mind, the 4 words that you're exposed to are adventurous, self-confident, independent, and persistent. Okay? These are all relatively positive words, and it turns out that each of these 4 words is going to be applicable or relevant to one of the sentences that you're going to read about Donald in the second task. Okay? In another condition, the 4 prime words are reckless, conceited, aloof, and stubborn. These are all negative words, but they're applicable to the exact same sentences. As you can see, you could imagine that the same behavior could either be described as adventurous or reckless. Okay? A person could be described as self-confident or conceited. So what they're trying to do is bias the subjective construal that subjects will have in that next task. Okay? So you either get trait words that are applicable to the next task and are positive, applicable to the next task and are negative, or you get other prime words that are positive or negative but are not applicable. They're not relevant to the sentences that you're going to read about Donald in the second task. Now, at this point in the study, you don't know what the second task is about at all. You've just done this incredibly boring working memory task. You're grateful that they're paying you to do this, because otherwise, why would anyone spend their time doing this? They say, thank you, can you go down the hall to the next room? You go down to the hall to the next room, they sit you down, and they say, we'd like you to read this paragraph about this person named Donald. And it's this long paragraph that sort of describes things that Donald did, you know, what he likes to do in his free time. He already climbed Mount McKinley and all these other things. And then there's these key sentences embedded in there. He was thinking, perhaps, that he would do some skydiving or maybe cross the Atlantic in a sailboat. So that behavior is where those first 2 words in the positive and negative applicable conditions apply. So you could either describe that behavior as adventurous or reckless. You don't see this in parentheses if you're in the study. I'm showing this to you so you know where those words are applicable. And then, by the way he acted, one could readily guess that Donald was aware of his ability to do many things well. So here you might think that he's either self-confident or conceited. And Higgins was trying to see, could I bias which of those people sort of use to make sense of him with those prime words I gave him. Now, after they read the paragraph, they're now asked to make ratings of Donald. They're asked to make an overall positivity rating of Donald. Essentially, how much do you like Donald or think Donald is a good person? Now, this is a little dim here. Hopefully you can see there's a high gray bar here and a low green bar here. When you get applicable primes, so self-confident or conceited, those applicable primes lead you to make either very positive judgments of Donald or very negative judgments of Donald, non-positive judgments of Donald. But when you get other generally positive and negative words, So let's go back. Words like disrespectful, grateful, words that have nothing to do with the paragraph, those don't affect people's judgments of Donald. So when people are primed with these words, it affects their judgment of Donald, but only if the words were applicable to the behaviors that Donald engaged in. Okay? So this is pretty amazing if you think about it, because these people have no idea that their assessment of Donald is being affected by some incredibly boring task they did 5 minutes earlier. Right? From our perspective, we can see, okay, well, so priming works this way. But as the person in this study, you have no idea that it's those earlier primes that are affecting you. Okay? And if someone now told you, do you know the reason you rated Donald positively is because you did a working memory task where you held the word self-confident in mind? People would say, that's not why I rated Donald positively. I rated Donald positively because sailing across the Atlantic in a sailboat is really cool and awesome. And that's kind of a neat thing that someone would want to do. The problem that they don't realize is that they've automatically been biased by those primes, because if they had gotten the negative primes, they'd now be saying, no, the reason I rated Donald negatively wasn't because of those primes. It's because taking a sailboat across the Atlantic is just stupid. Why would I want to be friends with someone like that who just doesn't think that clearly? They would both think that they had come up with this on their own. No one would say, yeah, it was those prime words that made me experience Donald in a positive or negative light. Okay? So, the positive and negative primes in the unrelated task can affect our liking of David, but only when the prime traits are applicable to Donald's behavior. Okay? And what's important here is that the subjects are unaware of the relation of what they did in the first task to the second task. They are not, however, unaware that they did the first task. So it doesn't matter whether or not you're consciously aware that you saw the word self-confident or not. What's important is whether or not that you're aware that there's a link between that and the later judgment that you're going to make. So the unawareness is about the link between the prime and the judgment, not whether or not you consciously saw the prime word at all. Yeah? No. So you either saw these 4 prime words or you saw these 4 prime words. Nobody sees both. Okay. Any other questions on this study? Yeah.
Is this kind of related to like hypothesis 3 when it says we don't know what we don't know?
Yeah, sure. We don't know. I mean, it's an example of it in the sense that we don't realize that we've been biased in this way. So we're biased, and we're not only biased, but we're biased without knowing it. So the fact that we're biased is more about, hypotheses 1 and 2. The fact that we don't realize that we're biased is what hypothesis 3 is about. Okay. Now, that first study was done with words that you saw consciously. The second way people will sometimes assess automaticity is by using subliminal primes. Subliminal means something is presented so quickly that you can't consciously recognize what it is. You might see just a flash of light, but you're not going to recognize that there was a word there or what the meaning of the word was. What was the word that I was exposed to? So you can do a similar kind of study where you now, instead of having people do that first task where they hold the words consciously in mind, you can subliminally present the prime words. Okay? This is a study done by John Barge. He's going to come up a lot because he's done a lot of really, really important work. He's one of those other top 5, I think, most important people in social cognition. He's probably, over the last 10 years, done the most important work on automaticity. And his name is pronounced Barge, not Barg, or Bark. And so what he does in phase 1 of this study, which is similar but a little bit different than the Donald study that you saw before, is he has people engage in what they believe is a vigilance task. They're told to press a key every time they see a flash on the screen, but really that flash is masking the presentation of subliminal words. And everybody's in one of 2 conditions with respect to the primes. Either most of the prime words that you see are related to hostility and hostility traits, or only occasionally do you see prime words that are related to hostility. So you're either in a high hostility or a low hostility priming condition. But the words are all presented subliminally, so people don't recognize that they've been exposed to them. And then in phase 2, they read 12 sentences about Donald. Okay, now, one thing I have to tell you, an aside, once Torrey Higgins did his first Donald study, hundreds of people have done similar studies where you're making judgments of someone. Every single time, they use the name Donald. Okay? And it turns out that Donald, I asked Torrey Higgins, where'd you get the name Donald from for this? And he said, oh, Donald Duck. So Donald Duck is the source of all these studies. So this is another Donald study. This time you read a 12-sentence paragraph about Donald, and this time there are sentences included that are ambiguous with respect to hostility. Remember, the crossing the Atlantic in a sailboat is ambiguous as to whether or not it's adventurous or reckless, right? It could go either way. You could see it either way, depending on your mood, depending on what's active in your mind. Here, the sentences were ambiguous with respect to hostility. So, for instance, a salesman knocked at the door, but Donald refused to let him enter. Okay? Maybe that's hostile. Maybe it's understandable. He also told me that he was refusing to pay his rent until the landlord repaints the apartment. Again, could go either way. You may have your own impression, but you should recognize that other people are probably having the exact opposite impression because that's the way construal works. What he was interested in was how did these prime words affect our judgments of Donald in terms of Donald's trait-level hostility. Okay? So in phase 3, you evaluate Donald. You evaluate him on various traits. Some of the traits are hostility-related, like hostile, aggressive, and some are unrelated to hostility. Okay, greedy, athletic, or unathletic. Those would be the ends of a question, how athletic or unathletic is he? And what they found, and on the y-axis here, it's how negative a particular rating was. So higher numbers mean more negative. And what they found is that when you were judging hostility-related traits, which means the primes were applicable, because they're hostility primes that are applicable to hostility-related traits, you rated Donald as more negative if you got lots of negative primes than if you only got a few negative primes. Okay? But when you're rating these other traits that are unrelated to hostility, the hostility primes have almost no effect. You don't rate Donald as super negative if you are rating him on traits that aren't related to hostility. Okay? So these subliminal messages, these subliminal words that you're being exposed to, affect the way you immediately experience Donald. So remember, we talk about we don't see snakes and decide they're dangerous. We see dangerous snakes. Okay? These primes are affecting how we see the snakes, or in this case, how we see Donald. And it's how we immediately experience Donald, not how we, construct a logical argument about Donald. It's an immediate reaction through our subjective construals. Okay. So, percentage of hostility primes affect our judgments of Donald, who has engaged in ambiguously hostile behavior. The primes are shaping our construals, but only when the construals are applicable to the particular traits that are being judged. It shouldn't say behaviors there. Okay, we're going to the third, and for today, final form of assessing automaticity that we're going to discuss. In some ways, this is my favorite form. I know it's weird that someone could have a favorite form of automaticity assessment, but I do. So this is using cognitive load. And cognitive load, okay, just means getting someone distracted with something else that's not actually relevant to the particular thing that you want to really measure. Okay? So you're going to read about Bob the priest. Okay? And you're going to read about Bob the priest, but at the same time that you're reading about Bob the priest, some of you are going to be given an 8-digit number that you have to rehearse in mind and are going to have to later give back to me as accurately as you can. Okay? So some people are busy saying 518649275851864927, right? It's sort of mentally taxing to do this, and it puts you under cognitive load, or it makes you cognitively busy. These are all different terms that get used for the same thing. And then while you're doing that, you're shown 30 sentences. 10 of the sentences about Bob are consistent with Bob showing kindness. Okay? 10 are inconsistent with kindness, and 10 are just filler sentences related to other things. You know, his shoes are size 10. One of the things that's important to understand this study is that it's well known that in general we remember inconsistent information about someone better than consistent information. So we have a general association with priests being kind. It's part of their job description. Okay? So that should suggest from the classic literature that we would remember these inconsistent sentences better than the consistent sentences. Okay? And that's been shown dozens of times. Okay? The thought is that you have to do extra work to make sense of those inconsistent behaviors that are described to you. You're trying to figure out, how do I make that fit with my understanding of him as a kindly priest guy? Okay? So, when people were not under cognitive load, when they were not rehearsing this 8-digit number, they showed the classic memory effect for these sentences. Okay? They recognized, it was a recognition task, so they were shown the sentences again, along with new sentences that they hadn't seen before. And if they were not under cognitive load, they recognized more of the kindness inconsistent sentences than the kindness consistent sentences. What they were interested in, though, is what happened to this difference when you put people under cognitive load. What happens when they were distracted while reading those sentences? And what they found is that this effect disappears. It completely disappears. Okay? What does this mean? What this tells us is if you can only get this extra bump here when you're not under cognitive load, it tells you that this effect is not due to an automatic process. Okay? It means that this effect takes cognitive effort, and if you are under cognitive load, you can't apply that cognitive effort. It suggests that it takes effort to think through, how do I make sense of this unkind behavior that Bob the priest has engaged in? But when you're under cognitive load, you're just too busy to do it. So you don't end up engaging in that extra mental elaboration of those inconsistent sentences, and so the effect goes away. Okay? People understand? Now, had this effect been there in the cognitive load condition, so if the cognitive load condition had looked just like this, instead the interpretation would have been, this effect occurs automatically. Now that's not what happened, but that could have happened, and that would have been the interpretation. Okay. Now I will tell you that while I think this is a nice demonstration of this effect, it's not my favorite study of this, but my favorite studies of this are already in other lectures for the whole rest of the quarter. And I didn't want to give one of those up just to tell you about this up front. So this is not the most exciting study doing this. We'll come back to others that are way better. But this is how cognitive load works. And I just said all of this. Now, this will be your favorite 30 seconds of the lecture. Here's the study that we're not going to cover today. Giant X, giant X, giant X, giant X, giant X, giant X. Woo! 15 minutes saved right there. So, thank you. I'm glad that that's what we get an applause for in this class. In that case, I might as well just skip through the rest of the lecture. So, what's the definition of automaticity? Automaticity is largely defined by what it doesn't do and what it doesn't require. Okay, it's sort of defined negatively. The definition is essentially that it doesn't require your intention, your awareness. Automatic processes don't interfere with other processes, and they don't require effort. Okay, so we can consider this square, this red square. You don't need to have the intention to know the color of this square for you to experience it as red. Okay? Now, the awareness one's a little tricky when we talk about this. Obviously, you're aware that this square is red, but you are not aware of how your mind or brain got you to see that. You have no idea what processes were going on inside your mind that allowed you to see that. Okay? And seeing this red square doesn't interfere with other stuff that you might be doing at the same time. So for instance, if I asked you to try to memorize some Shakespeare sonnets, okay, whether or not you were doing that with this red square up here or not would not affect your ability to memorize the sonnets. Okay? You might do terribly or really well. That depends on your motivation and effort. But it would have nothing to do with there being a red square in front of you. So it doesn't interfere with that ability. And it doesn't require effort. It didn't take any work for you to see this square as red. It just magically appears that way. And on the intention front, okay, yeah, no, I think we're good. Now, these are the 4 characteristics that are classically always associated with automaticity. They were really formalized by John Barge back in the 1980s, but we can go back to William James, who in the 1890s wrote about all of these things. Okay? So if you go back to the 1890s, or 1890 itself, William James wrote a book called Principles of Psychology. Okay? It's the biggest psychology book you'll ever find. The first volume is this thick, and the second volume is this thick. Okay? It was so big, they broke it into 2 volumes. And he has a whole chapter on automaticity, and he talks all about these things. And in general, if you have a deep interest in psychology, I strongly encourage you to go read The Principles of Psychology by William James, 1890. It was written 110 years ago, but I would argue that it is still the best book ever written about psychology. And I will even go so far as to say, I think he got more right then than we get right now in our textbooks. Okay? I think he understood more, and we have progressively understood less since he wrote that book. So I think it's a fabulous book that is really, really important. He's kind of my hero. He's my wife's hero. So much so that we actually named our son after him, Ian James. Yeah, actually, my kid's not that cute, so I just got a picture of a cute kid and put him up here. No, I'm kidding. That's my kid. And he has about the same amount of hair as William James also. So that's the classic definition of automaticity. Okay. I like to add 2 other characteristics to it that are sometimes included in other people's models and aren't, but sometimes aren't. That is phenomenal immediacy. Okay? We have an immediate experience of things, and those are the things that are automatic. Okay? So up here, these sort of describe kind of the computational characteristics. This describes the fact that when something's automatic, it's just immediately part of our experience. So we see dangerous snakes. We don't see snakes and then decide they're dangerous after the fact. And things that are automatic are experienced as reality out there in the world. So even though it is your mind that is constructing this as a red square, okay, a huge part of your capacity to see that as a red square is inferential processes going on in your brain, going on in your visual cortex. Okay, but we don't experience it that way. We experience it as 100% out in the world as reality, not coming from in here in my mind. So, where do our automatic processes, our automatic abilities come from? Okay. We develop associations and what are referred to as associative networks over the course of our lifespan. Okay. And we learn all sorts of associations. We learn that Romeo and Juliet go together just because those are repeated frequently when we're, taking high school English or whatever it is. And so we learn that association. We learn that men are bad at English and women are bad at math. Okay? It doesn't mean those things are true, but those are associations that if you're raised in the United States, you are going to learn whether those are conscious associations or non-conscious associations. And we'll come back towards the end of the quarter and talk about how these associations can get us into trouble and actually lead us to confirm these associations even though they're not necessarily true. Okay? And the way these associative networks operate is that if you prime one part of an association, the other part comes closer to conscious awareness. So when I say Romeo, Juliet sort of jumps up in terms of its closeness to conscious awareness, and it actually crosses the threshold for conscious awareness. So this is undoubtedly kind of completely wrong. It doesn't really make sense to talk about consciousness this way, but it's a simple heuristic for thinking about it. We can imagine that there's some threshold here represented by the dotted line for conscious awareness, and in your mind you have a vast storehouse of female names that you know that won't be the first time you've heard them if somebody says them, and they're stored somehow in your mind and brain. They're already there, and they're all below conscious awareness, because until I put up this screen, none of you were thinking Amanda, Jennifer, Sarah, Ashley, Brittany, Juliet. It's only because I put them up on the screen, and if you read the screen, some of those now became part of your conscious awareness. Okay? So this dotted line represents a point on this y-axis of accessibility or closeness to conscious awareness. So the higher you are, sort of the more easy it is to bring that particular thing into conscious awareness. Jennifer is easier to bring into conscious awareness than Juliet most of the time. Okay? If I asked everyone to just think of a name, and I hadn't said anything about Romeo in the last half hour, way more people would come up with these names than would come up with Juliet. Okay? And that's because most of you were born around the time that these were very popular names. So I took this from the 1980 list, 10 most popular female names used to name babies that year. So you probably all know a lot of people with these names, and this was not one of the most popular names that year. But when I say Romeo, things move. Juliet jumps up. It jumps up so far that it crosses the threshold for conscious awareness. It comes to mind, and whether you say it out loud or not, you kind of hear your internal voice say Juliet when you hear Romeo. Okay? Now, other things happen too. For instance, for some of you, when I say Romeo, out of the blue, you might suddenly get Leonardo hopping up there. Okay? Because he played Romeo in a very bad adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. And so there's all sorts of things that might come to mind because there's various things that you might have associated with Romeo. Shakespeare would also come up. But the key thing is when I say Romeo, Leonardo and Shakespeare become more accessible, but they don't cross this line. You don't find yourself when I say Romeo and then I say, what comes next, you don't say Juliet, Shakespeare, Leonardo. We just say Juliet. But the other ones are close. So that if the next question was, name a famous writer, you would be more likely to say Shakespeare, even though that hadn't consciously come to mind here. Okay, and you'd be more likely to do that, particularly if you didn't know that I was trying to prime you. All right. So another key construct, another key idea here in talking about automaticity is what's called chronic accessibility. So we were just talking about accessibility, and if I prime you with Romeo, Juliet becomes more accessible temporarily. Okay? But there are some things that for each of us are chronically accessible, which means they stay close to the conscious line for us because they're things that we've done over and over and over in our lives or thought about again and again in our lives, and so they stay very close to consciousness for us and never fall that far down. And those things are called chronically accessible. They're also called schemas, things that we have strong representations of that we can bring to mind very easily, and they have to do with our personal past, our experiences, determine which things are going to stay close to consciousness for us and which things won't. So these things have been used so often, the system being your brain, just keeps them close to conscious awareness all the time. And that's a useful thing. If you use these representations all the time, you want to keep them close to conscious awareness so that you can use them more efficiently. Okay? These chronically accessible representations are constantly shaping our subjective construals. Okay? So you all have different chronic accessible representations. You share some, but you also have different ones. Okay? And the ones that are different are a big part of why we end up seeing the world differently, because we each use our own chronically accessible representations to guide our subjective construals without us realizing it. Okay? So for instance, for most people, their own name stays right here. Okay? Because they've heard their name so much that it becomes very accessible and it never stops being accessible. So if you're at a party and somebody says your name across the room, you're much more likely to hear it than if it's another name. That's called the cocktail party effect. Okay? And that's because your name is much more accessible to consciousness, which means you need that much less to bump it over the threshold where you go, wait, I heard someone say my name. So, what drives our chronically accessible representations? Well, if you're a long-time smoker, you've got different ones. Okay? If you spend a lot of time thinking about power dynamics or gender and in the context of power, you're going to have different chronically accessible representations than people who haven't spent a lot of time thinking about those things. Are you deeply religious? Those will shape our chronically accessible representations as well and shape the way you see and judge other people's behavior. But remember, these things influence us without us realizing that they're influencing us. So you see the world through this filter, this symphony of chronically accessible constructs, okay, and that's how we see the world. And you could make an argument that this is a large part of what defines culture. Culture is about a large group of people having a set of shared, chronically accessible constructs. Okay? If you share those constructs, it binds you together at an immediate experiential level. You see the world. You don't just think about the world. You see the world in similar ways. And there'll be differences too. Everyone will have their own. But in the United States, we tend to have this chronically accessible construct for independence, sort of being your own person. And in East Asian countries, there tends to be a chronically accessible construct for interdependence, the way we all sort of harmonize together to bring about the best outcome for all. Okay? One isn't right and one is wrong, but rather if you're in one of those cultures, you're exposed to that idea visually from our parents, all different forms, again and again and again, and it gets in and shapes the way we then see and experience the world. All right. So, we've talked about priming. I say Romeo, you say Juliet. We've talked about chronically accessible constructs, which are kind of there with you all the time. So, John Barge asked the question, what happens when you pit these two against each other? When you pit a prime and a chronically accessible construct that go in opposite directions, what happens when you pit them against each other? Which one wins out and guides your subjective construals? Okay? So what if you are chronically accessible for adventurous, but then you're primed with reckless? Which one wins? Okay? Anyone have a guess? Anyone want to raise their hand and give a guess? How many people think the primes win? How many people think the chronically accessible things win? How many people think it's more complicated than that? You're right. Everyone would have said that last one, but I gave you that choice last, so you didn't know that choice was coming. Okay, so in this study, what they actually did is they found out who was chronically accessible for seeing the world in terms of inconsiderate or talkative. So they found people who were chronically accessible for inconsiderate, and they found other people who were chronically accessible for talkative. And I think in the data I'm going to show you, I'm only going to be focusing on the people who are chronically accessible for inconsiderate. That means they tend to see the world in terms of whether or not people are being inconsiderate or not. It's a very salient dimension for them. He had them engage in a priming task, and here the priming task was you would see a mixed up sentence like dog the mail letter, and your job would be to unscramble it and drop one word. So you would drop the word dog, rearrange it to be mail the letter. Okay, that would be one sentence unscramble. There were 20 of these kinds of sentences, and there was, for half of the subjects, they got the prime, she inconsiderate was, she is inconsiderate, or in another condition, they got the prime, she is talkative. You drop was and change it to she is talkative. So you've got people who are either chronically accessible for inconsiderate or talkative, and now they've been primed with either inconsiderate or talkative. And now you read behavioral descriptions of a person, and one of the descriptions you read is, he monopolized the telephone where he lived. You know, imagine back when I was in college, if you didn't have a phone in your own dorm room because you didn't want to pay for it, there was the one phone that was in the hallway that was shared, and there was always that person who monopolized the telephone in the hallway. And so you could interpret this either as being inconsiderate or talkative, right? Either of those are reasonable ways to think about that behavior. And the other key thing that they did in this study was they manipulated how much time there was between when you saw the prime word in that priming task and when you saw this sentence where you had to judge the person. So sometimes, and we're only going to talk about two of these conditions, sometimes you saw the prime word, she is talkative, and then 15 seconds later you got this sentence. Okay, so they were really close in time. And other times you would see this prime word, and then 3 minutes would go by before you would get to see this sentence. And the way you do this is you manipulate whether the prime sentence is the first or last sentence out of the 20. If it's the first sentence, there's going to be about 3 minutes before you finish that task and get to this task. If it's the last sentence, you can go right to this task, and there's only a 15-second break between them. And this ends up being really important. Subjects are asked, after they see this sentence, to just spontaneously choose one word to describe this person who monopolized the telephone. So these are, these are individuals. Okay, so let me break this down by time. So when it's only 15 seconds, and you're looking at the number of people who spontaneously come up with the word inconsiderate, it's a relatively small percentage if they've been primed with talkative. So everyone here has been primed with the word talkative. Everyone has been primed with talkative. And if there's only a 15-second delay, talkative is the most popular word that comes up, and inconsiderate doesn't come up that often. Okay? But if 3 minutes have gone by since you were primed with the word talkative, now people who are chronically accessible for inconsiderate, they come up with inconsiderate. Okay? The key thing to understand about this particular data is that for a very short period of time, maybe up to about 2 minutes, the prime word will win out over the chronically accessible construct. But then after a few minutes, the prime word stops affecting you so much, and the chronically accessible construct wins out. So in the short term, the prime wins, and in the long term, the chronically accessible construct wins. Okay? And this makes sense. Your chronically accessible constructs are the things that you've built up over a lifetime to be the things you care about and want to be focusing on, the way you want to see the world based on your past ways of trying to see the world. And that's a very useful thing. However, you also want to be flexible and adaptive in response to things that are subtly changing in the situation. So you want to be sensitive to things in the situation that are important right now, and so that's why the prime words temporarily affect us, but then over time it fades away, and our long-standing way of seeing the world returns and drives things. Okay, all the results are described again there. Now, up till this point, all the Donald-type studies that I've been telling you about, and the Bob the Priest studies and all of these, they've all been about priming social perception. That is, we use prime words like adventurous and reckless to affect how one person perceives or sees another person. It's how one person judges another person. Okay? And for 20 years, this is the only place that people thought priming affected people in the social domain. Okay? And then there was this groundbreaking paper in 1996. Once again, John Barge. This paper kind of turned the entire field of social psychology on its head, and frankly, 50% of the papers that have been done since 1996 in social psychology till now owe some debt to this particular paper that I'm going to show you a couple studies from. Because this is where automaticity starts to get weird and wacky. He wanted to see if you could prime behavior using prime words and not just prime people's judgments of others. Okay? So in the first of these studies, he primed people with politeness or rudeness. And he did this through a sentence unscrambling task like the one I showed you before. If you were in the polite condition, you would unscramble sentences that just happened to have words in them like polite, respect, behaved. If you were in the rude condition, you unscrambled sentences with words like rude, intrude, infringe. Okay? And you're given this task to do with a whole bunch of sentences to unscramble. And the experimenter tells you, he says, when you're done, I'll be right down the hall. So just bring me your answers when you're done, and I'll be right down the hall, 2 doors down. So you spend about 5 minutes doing this task, which is priming you. The whole point of the task is to prime you. You finish, you get up, you walk to the other room, and when you get to the door of the other room, the experimenter is having a conversation with someone else. And he's not looking at you. Okay? So he's looking just enough away from you, so if you're the subject and you're looking in, he's kind of like this. And he's talking to someone here. And all the experimenter really cared about is how long it takes you to interrupt. See, because they've primed you with either being polite or rude. Okay? And they also had a condition where you weren't primed with anything, I believe. So a neutral condition where you're not primed with either. Okay? And so what they were interested in, and it's crazy that this is the dependent variable, how many subjects interrupt the conversation within 10 minutes? Another way put is, how many people don't interrupt for a full 10 minutes? Okay? Here's what happened. If you're primed with polite, 17% of people interrupt, and the other 83% just stand there listening to this stupid, rehearsed conversation. The neutral condition, 40% interrupt, but in the rude condition, 70% interrupt. So the prime was driving people to interrupt or not. But of course, they have no idea that that's what led them to interrupt or not. That seems crazy. I've got to tell you about one more before we go, and then that'll be the last study for today. This one is the blockbuster study that most people go, no, that couldn't be right. But it's been replicated like 20 times. And here's what it is. Same sort of setup, but now you're primed with words related to the elderly or not. Okay? So you do the sentence unscrambling task for about 5 minutes. You're either primed with words related to the elderly or not. And then you're thanked for your participation and you're told, thank you very much, you're done, have a nice life. And then they surreptitiously measure how long it takes the subject to walk from the lab to the elevator. And they're interested in how long do subjects take to walk this distance if they've been primed with elderly or not. And people take longer. This is how much time they took. They take longer to walk there if they've been primed with the elderly. So the way people understood this study, and I don't know that I fully agree with it, is that when you are primed with words related to the elderly, you become the elderly. It changes how you actually behave because you become like that thing that's been primed. Okay, I'll see you in a week. I'll have office hours tomorrow, 12:30 to 2:30.